The quote is, "Romantic love is a universal experience deeply embedded in the human brain." And we're going to talk more about exactly what she means by romantic love. What we're going to talk about is that there are 3 different kinds of love that each serve different purposes and each have their own unique brain pathways and neurotransmitters associated with it. So that's where we're starting off with today. And I always feel a little bit strange talking about the neurobiology of love and just hopping right into the brain pathways and the neurotransmitters right off the bat. So I like to do a little bit of a placeholder slide and talk about Sternberg's triangular theory of love. For 2 reasons. One, this triangular theory of love kind of anchors the talk in the emotional aspect of passion versus commitment versus liking, the different combinations of these different kinds of feelings of attachment and the kinds of love that they produce. But it also wraps around really neatly at the very end where I finish out the talk and refer back to this figure. So Sternberg's triangular theory of love states that there's an infatuation component, which is more that passion component. We're going to talk about it in the context of lust. And then there's the intimacy aspect, which is more the liking aspect of love, which we're going to talk about in the context of romantic attraction. That's the second phase. And then there's the commitment aspect of love, which is represented in the part of the talk today that's described by romantic attachment. So each of these more emotional aspects have very distinct brain regions and very distinct neurotransmitters associated with them. So it's a nice way to kind of start. Okay, so I like to give kind of a table of contents slide, and so I will show this slide again every time I change sections. What you have there on the left side of the slide is this beautiful figure. It's written in German, so the original gray boxes there are the German. So if anybody can read German, you won't need the translations. But the translations right next to it provide a nice kind of launching point for us to begin talking about that first type of love, which is lust or passion, and it's primarily characterized by autonomic functioning. So you see some of the descriptions there on what our body goes through when our autonomic system is activated. We get enlarged pupils, flushed cheeks. We actually have an increased sense of smell, which is one of those offshoots that I'm going to try to avoid today, but if anybody wants to talk about that, write it down and we can talk about it at the end. Racing heart, butterflies in the stomach, wet hands, blood flow to the genitals, trembling knees, all of those reactions when we are in the lust phase is triggered by the autonomic system. The second part of the talk, we're going to talk about attraction, which is an entirely different set of brain areas and neurotransmitters. And then, as I said, we're going to finish up with attachment. All right, so let's start off talking about lust. When we talk about lust, we're referring to the sex drive. We're referring to libido. And the definition for lust is the craving for sexual gratification. In trying to find images that represent lust, I recommend not doing a Google search without putting any qualifiers on there. This is about as PG as I could get for a talk that has pictorial representations of this particular aspect. We've got Disney princes and princesses recharacterized in different ways. What I wanted to emphasize on this slide is that each of our sections is going to start off with a definition and then also provide a function for that particular type of love. So lust is all about a craving for sexual gratification, and it is the motivating aspect of this kind of range of love categories that we're going to talk about today. The basic function of the sex drive is to promote copulation with any remotely appropriate partner. Okay, so our focus is really on motivating that that part of species propagation and copulation with someone who is just even remotely distinctly appropriate. The brain activity during lust is primarily characterized by autonomic functioning, as I said, and sensory processing. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on this figure. Let me just give you a few anchor points to help you understand what it is I'm talking about here. We've got the autonomic system is characterized by sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system is the part that is activated during the lust or sex drive portion of this talk. That's where you get increases in things like blood pressure and heart rate. That's where you get dilation of the pupils. You get blood flow to the genitals. You get those sweaty palms. That sort of activates the individual and primes them for action. Now, the action could be of the sex type, or it could be of, oh my God, there's a predator, I have to get the heck out of here. The sympathetic nervous system activates in situations of arousal, but arousal is a very broad term. The parasympathetic system basically brings all of that back down to homeostasis. So if your pupils dilated when you saw somebody who you were lusting after, when they went away, your parasympathetic system would constrict those pupils again. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some studies that investigated this particular aspect of the love pathway that we're going to be talking about. In this study, there were 20 males and 20 females, and they were about 21 to 29 years of age, so they ranged the 20s. And the individuals in this study were meant to watch erotic films as well as neutral films. So they were watching two different types of films. And the idea here was to figure out what kinds of responses they were going to have. Now, can anybody take a guess? And you go ahead and unmute yourselves if you need to, or type it in the chat box. Why do you think a neutral segment was necessary for this particular study? And let me characterize this by saying that the studies that we're going to talk about were investigating activity in brain areas. So what areas of the brain were active during erotic films compared to more neutral, like nature films or something along those lines? Why do you think a neutral film would have been necessary?
Any guesses? I got a control group.
Yep. Exactly. Okay, so I'm not seeing those. Yeah, exactly. They needed a control group to show, for example, this is the kind of brain activity that's involved when people are just looking at something and processing information, that visual sensory information. No matter what the individual was looking at, there was going to be some activity related just to simply looking at a visual stimulus. And so that control provided, or the neutral scene provided that control for the change in brain activity that would occur when the individual was looking at an erotic film. Okay. What they found is that sexual arousal was similar, and this was, the sexual arousal was quantified by a subjective rating system where the individual was self-reporting, yes, this was arousing, no, this wasn't, medium, that kind of thing. That was similar between men and women, but here's the thing that makes it a little bit of an asterisk. The women that were enrolled in this first study, let me turn on my pen. The women that were enrolled in this first study were during their ovulatory period. These women were not outside of the ovulatory period. Can anybody take a guess as to why that would be important?
No guesses? Okay, here's one from Deborah. Arousal to reproduce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sex response for at least processing of the sexual stimuli is simply different when women are in the ovulatory phase of their menstrual cycle compared to outside their menstrual cycle. And that was established here with this and a number of studies. And so it's important that if men and women were going to be compared in terms of mere sexual arousal, so I'm emphasizing the lust aspect, not attraction and not attachment, just in the motivation for copulation, that there be a distinction for women in terms of what stage of the menstrual cycle they were in. So that was really important. So then when they did control for that, they found that there weren't a heck of a lot of differences in terms of just arousal between men and women, as long as those women were during the ovulatory part of the cycle. Let's see, anything I want to say else about this? Sexual arousal was significantly lower between women who were not in their ovulatory period compared to women who were in their ovulatory period. And that's what this second study showed. So in this first study, there was no difference between men and women who were in the ovulatory period. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Did they also study left-handed students? Why limit to right-handed?
I know. It's funny. I was trying to figure out exactly why they would limit it to one particular hand, and that's going to be a common theme among all of these studies. And I haven't been able to find a really great answer as to why they limited it to that. I imagine that they anticipated that there would be some extra variability introduced by handedness, but I'm not exactly sure what particular explanation that was for, or what particular thing that they were trying to control for. So that's a great question that I'd have to dive a little deeper into these studies to really figure out what that rationale is. And usually it's not like that study, it's like they cited a study who cited a study who cited a study, and then that explanation is buried way deep down in there. So it wasn't really described in that particular study. All right. So in this study where they found not a heck of a lot of sex differences between men and women in all of the brain areas that they studied, because there were eight brain areas that they examined. In 7 of the 8 areas, there wasn't a heck of a lot of difference, no statistically significant differences, which suggests at minimum that there are similar systems that are active for things like attention, for emotional reactivity, for urges, for impulse control. Because if you're watching an erotic film in a lab, maybe you want to control some impulses, so there are similar brain regions that are active for that, and for autonomic responses, which isn't hugely surprising that that would be similar. But there was one difference, and that was in the hypothalamus of men. The hypothalamus and the thalamus of men was activated to a greater degree than it did for women. So for all other things, they were equal, but for men, there was a difference. Now, the hypothalamus regulates sex behavior and physiological arousal. This is the kind of activation that's needed for, penile tumescence and other subjective measures of arousal. There are 2 problems with this study that make the conclusion that I have written here by the study's authors problematic. So the authors concluded that the greater hypothalamic activation could be viewed as suggesting that male subjects were physiologically more aroused than female subjects. And these were the females who were ovulating in response to the erotic film segment. But this assumes 2 things. And we know what happens when we assume things, right? It assumes that one, female sex arousal is also regulated primarily by the hypothalamus. We don't know if it is, and that was one of the only brain regions that that was examined outside of those brain regions that looked at simply attention and visual processing and those kinds of things. So this assumes that men and women have same brain area activations when they're aroused. The second is that it assumes that similar stimuli is arousing for both men and women. So to follow up, there was another study that was conducted, this time with 10 men and 10 women, again right-handed, and they watched erotic and neutral films too, but this time they used different types of erotic films. So these subjects were watching 3 different types of movies. They were watching the neutral movies, they were watching physical types of erotic films that focused really closely and primarily on the physical contact, the sexual activity, and direct exposure of genitalia. And then the third type was mood type. So this is kind of erotica with a storyline that's focused on mood and relationship development. Still very much erotica, but a little bit different emphasis. Okay, so these subjects watching 3 different types of movies, the results of this particular study was different. Do you think that they had the same level of arousal? I'm not talking about women having lower arousal and men having higher arousal when watching the erotic films. I'm saying combined together, looking at erotic films, do you think that they had the same level of arousal? Yes or no? That would work if I could see you.
Probably the same.
Probably the
No,
same.
no.
Yes, yes, they are. got the same level of arousal. Do you think they got the same level of arousal from the same video type? Yes or no?
I got women are aroused by mood. Got lots of things coming in here.
Exactly. Exactly.
No, no.
Yeah. So here's the thing that I feel really strongly. Perhaps it's because I'm a woman who is, often told, mansplained about my sexuality. Look, men and women experience sexual arousal similarly, but yeah, the arousal is in response to different stimuli. So I need to read you this quote from the previous paper, the one that found that there was a difference in the hypothalamus in men, but not, or that there was a difference in the hypothalamus where they concluded that men were just more aroused. Here's how they picked the videos that they showed. Uh, Given that women tend to experience more disgust than men during viewing of erotic film excerpts, a selection procedure was implemented whereby erotic film excerpts were presented to 5 female subjects, and the 6 excerpts with the lowest average disgust scores were collated. Of wonderful things associated with the sex drive that make it healthy. First off, individuals have a greater degree of immunocompetence, in other words, better immune systems when they have sex when they're having sex frequently, but they have greater immunocompromise if that sex that they're having is with lots of different partners. And I have 2 studies shown there, the immunoglobulin study as well as the primate immune system study, because this is something that seems to be true across primate taxa. So that's an interesting byproduct of sexual activity. Blood pressure also is better in individuals that engage in intercourse than for people who had other or no sexual activity. And I want to point out that by other here, they're not talking about same-sex partners. I'm not sure why the title has such a fine point on it. My guess is that they simply didn't include same-sex couples. But by other, they mean things like, masturbation and other kinds of sexual activity or no sexual activity. So blood pressure was better. Um, Women who, this was a study where the subjects had a spinal cord injury, and women who had vaginal stimulation actually experienced an increase in their pain threshold, which meant their pain, the experience of their pain went down. So that's wonderful, pain reduction side effects. Individuals who have a high number of ejaculations show reduced risk of prostate cancer versus a low number of ejaculations. So that's awesome news. And then individuals who have sex on a regular basis get better sleep because sex increases prolactin levels, which is associated with sleepiness. So sex drive is good. Sex drive is healthy. Sex drive reduces pain. It's great. And that represents kind of the first stop along our road in discussing the different types of love. So I'm sorry I'm getting to be a long talker. I'm going to try to be a little less editorializing. The second phase of love that we're going to talk about is romantic attraction, okay? Romantic attraction is characterized by our motivation to pursue and receive a reward. So there are lots of things that motivate our behavior that are rewarding to us. And it turns out that not just sex is rewarding, but that feeling of romantic attraction is rewarding. And it's important to note that romantic attraction in this sense, when we're talking about the areas of the brain that are active and the neurotransmitters that are increasing, are entirely distinct from those that are inactive and increasing during lust, during the sex drive. So this is a very distinct part that we're talking about. Romantic attraction is characterized by how rewarding it is. The brain activity during romantic attraction is characterized by that pursuit of a drive motivated behavior, and that retrieval of a reward. And the idea is that it's meant to motivate us to prefer and pursue not just any remotely acceptable individual, which is what lust does, but rather a mate that is more suitable for us to to spend the necessary time and energy that's required to select a mate that will, once we get to the attraction stage, be somebody who we feel we can spend our lives with and raise a family with. So romantic attraction is the intermediate phase between lust and long-term commitment, and it's deliberately focused on reward. Now, romantic love facilitates satisfaction as a primary drive, specifically the mating drive. But what exactly is a drive? Well, a drive is going to be things like survival. I have a picture here of Aaron Ralston. He is the individual who was featured in that movie, 48 hours or 147 hours or something along those lines. But this guy fell into a canyon when he was hiking, and the only way that he was able to get out was by essentially cutting off his own arm. And so you see his prosthetic arm there. This is an intense drive for survival. We have a drive to live. We also have drives to eat and to drink, and of course, to have sex. That's what the whole sex drive lust aspect was about. But remember, when we're talking about lust, we're focusing in on choosing any remotely appropriate partner. But this rewarding aspect of romantic attraction focuses that drive so that we're choosing somebody who is worthy of our attention and our energy. So a drive is a neural state that directs behavior to acquire a specific biological need. Is everybody with me on that? Is there any questions that I can address? Looking good?
Nothing new here.
Okay, all right. All right, so all drive motivated behavior can be understood in the context of elevated levels of dopamine. When an individual has a drive, the behavior that's directed by dopamine is heightened energy. So you have more activity, focused attention, and almost obsessive thinking, like, oh my God, I need to have food, or oh, I'm so thirsty, I have to get water now. Or also a strong yearning to get what we seek. So these are things that are true not just for basic survival needs, but also for that phase of love where we are just starting something new and it is occupying every single second of our waking moments. You know, you're obsessively thinking about that person. Anytime you think about that person, you experience elevated heart rate and maybe even sweaty palms. And you're motivated to maintain proximity to that person as often as possible. So these are things that are characteristic not just of survival and of food and of water, but also of proximity to sex partners. The brain, when it's madly in love, so not lust, but madly in love, shows some very characteristic responses. So in this particular study, there were, again, 10 women and 7 men in that same similar age range with same right-handedness, and these individuals were intensely in love. How did they determine that these individuals were intensely in love? They interviewed the individuals and they had them fill out a couple of surveys. The interview helped establish how long the couple had been together, how intense their feelings were for each other, and the range of his or her feelings of love. So they might ask things like, I want, Billy physically, emotionally, and mentally. Or sometimes I can't control my thoughts. They're obsessively on, Shaniqua or something along those lines. The passionate love scale is going to quantify that intensity that's being interviewed about. And then the affect intensity measure is a general measure to assess the ability of that person to experience intense emotions. So you can experience intense highs and intense lows, but some people kind of are always at that same stable medium. And so the affect intensity measure was an assessment to quantify the capability of that person to feel things intensely. Now, this was another functional magnetic resonance imaging study where individuals' brain activity was assessed. So in the same vein as watching an erotic film and then a neutral film, this study used a kind of an experimental image as well as a control image. So in this case, for example, if I were a participant in the study, a photo of my beloved would appear while I was in the fMRI machine. And I believe my beloved is part of this talk today. You can wave if you can see them. Yeah. The photo of the beloved would be shown for 30 seconds. So the brain would respond when looking at that image. And then there would be a count back task. Individuals would have to start at some numbers like 7,342 and count back by like 7 for 40 seconds. So the count back task would happen, and then a photo of a neutral age-matched control would appear on the screen where previously the beloved had been. So again, if I were a subject, this might be my neutral age-matched control. This is an acquaintance of ours who was born basically within 2 weeks of Steve. And so I am acquainted with him. He's familiar to me, but he's neutral and he's age matched. So that kind of controls for that kind of activity in the brain. And then that count back task would happen again. So if we were to do this, it might look something like this. Are you counting back? And then the second picture shows, and then the count back task happens again. Now, can anybody say, we've already got a control picture in there. Can anybody tell me why we need the count back task? What does the count back task do?
Any guesses? Okay, to know if you're on the right track, again, give a control group, comparison level, evaluate your ability to focus.
Yeah, all of those things could certainly be in the mix. Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. When looking at each of the two pictures, there's visual stimuli. There's also like a face recognition activation. There's also a social kind of activation. And so the count back task was meant to essentially hit the reset button on the brain so that there's no activity left over from faces, from recognition of people, from visual processing. It was meant to sort of wipe the slate clean. Because the person was counting back in their head, and then the next visual stimulus would happen. So it was like an Uber control. It was like, let's get rid of any facial recognition, any social aspect, any visual stimuli, and we'll start again on the next 30 seconds. So yeah, it was essentially making sure that these were truly responses that were being associated with these particular stimuli. Now, there were many brain areas that were assessed. I'm going to talk about 4 of them. And the ventral tegmental area, the caudate body, and the septum, as well as the amygdala, these are all regions that are located either within the basal ganglia, which is, you are unable to see the basal ganglia unless you're doing an fMRI study. But if you're looking, like if I tried to find a picture to show you all of these regions, you have to use a cross section that enables you to see right in the center of the brain. The basal ganglia is one of the oldest parts of the brain. It's only newer than the reptilian part of the brain, the part of the brain that enables our heart to beat and our lungs to inflate and expel breath, and for us to continue to have those basic functions without thinking about them. That's sort of the reptilian brain. But the basal ganglia is where our reward centers, our emotion centers, and all those very primitive but slightly higher than reptilian functions are located. And in the ventral tegmental area and the right caudate body and the septum, all of that activity increased very specifically in response to the beloved's image, not during the count back task and not during the familiar neutral control. Now, I've got listed here what some of these brain regions are responsible for, and they all essentially are involved in reward and in pair bonding. So it is very consistent with this idea that romantic attraction is rewarding, that it is drive motivated, and that experiencing romantic attraction is pleasurable for us and rewarding for us. The only brain region that went down in activity compared to the count back task and the familiar neutral control was the amygdala's activity. But this makes perfect sense as well, because the amygdala is involved in identifying and categorizing fearful stimuli. So essentially what this means is that when we are in the presence of our beloved, when we are looking at pictures of our beloved, it reduces fearful responses in us. And I, for one, can attest to that because my husband is always in charge of getting rid of the spiders in the house. And so I know that if he's around, I never have to be worried of those freaks that have 8 legs. Why do they have so many legs? It's weird. So that is the thank you for the applause. I saw that out of the corner of my screen. um, cool. Another cool thing about romantic attraction. Nerve growth factor is a neurotransmitter in the brain that facilitates neuron growth and survival. And NGF appears to be elevated in individuals who are in this particular phase of love. So not during lust, not during attraction, but during this particular phase of love. And this is really interesting because it serves to illuminate that there could be biochemical correlates of complex feelings that are so deeply embedded in our lives, and also that there are biologically relevant pathways that are necessary for neuron survival in the context of this part of the love pathway specifically. What I also find incredibly fascinating is this other article, which discusses depression in the context of losing a loved one. So this could be losing a loved one because of death. It could be losing a loved one because of breaking up. It could be, just loss of a loved one. But what this study showed is that our brain, the neurons in our brains actually experience inflammation in the same way that our tissue would become inflamed if we experienced some kind of trauma. And so it really suggests that our brains, on separation of someone who has been in our lives and a loved one for a long period of time, undergoes a similar kind of response as our skin and muscle does if we experience trauma externally. And there are different brain cells called glia, which migrate to the area to repair that damage. And this is also a time when nerve growth factor is elevated. So it's suggesting a number of things that our brains are trying to adapt and respond and adjust to this new person in our lives. And we do so effectively that when that individual is gone, we have to sort of like adjust those pathways. I mean, think about a time when you've been heartbroken and you hear a song that you associate with that person, or you go to a place that you associate with that person. The person is not there anywhere, but you just feel this flood of just like, oh, I've just been, punched in the gut. This response is our brain's way of trying to adapt to just this sudden absence of this person from our lives. And it's completely normal to feel, well, depressed during this period of time. What differentiates this kind of depression from clinical depression is that this kind of depression does get repaired. It only lasts for a couple of months or a couple of weeks. What's the rule? Half the duration of the relationship or something? I don't know. But it's temporary, whereas clinical depression goes on and on and on and on and on. So that's an important distinction to make. Bottom line, romantic attraction is rewarding. The basic traits of romantic love mimic drive-motivated behavior, and any drive-motivated behavior is mediated by dopamine. These early romantic stages engage those same brain regions as the drive-motivated behaviors engage, using that neurotransmitter dopamine. Neurogenesis is drive-motivated areas occurs specifically in this early stage romantic love, not in lust, not in attachment, but in this type of romantic love. And then the regions that are involved in social bonding and fear reduction also increase during this phase. They don't increase during lust, and they continue to increase throughout the duration of long relationships, assuming that they continue to be loving, of course. Okay. So that finishes the middle segment. Can I address any questions now, Jim? Are people doing good?
Well, I have one question. Well, there's a couple now. I
Sure.
think you might have already addressed this one, but can you speak to any studies from heartbreaking, which is sort of what you've done just
Did
now?
I answer that question for the person who asked it? Yeah.
Well, that person is yeah, the response is
Good.
yes.
Okay, good.
The other, was there a minimal relationship duration requirement to differentiate madly in love from lust? Some be madly in love in the first moment without it being simply lust.
Yep. And that was conducted with the interviews helped that, but the passionate love scale, that was the thing that differentiated it from lust. What differentiates attraction from lust is that obsessive thinking and that drive to spend as much time in proximity to that specific person. Lust is a little bit more, as I said, any appropriate person. Could be person A, could be person B, could be person C, could be person D, doesn't really matter. In romantic attraction, the person specifically matters. So that's the main difference that was assessed with not just the interview, but also that passionate love scale. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's talk about attachment. This is our last type of love that I'm going to talk about. And this is all about forming and maintaining social bonds. So romantic attachment differentiates itself from lust and attraction because it is calming, which is the very opposite of attraction. Romantic attachment is associated with feelings of calm, security, social comfort, and emotional union. These are things that you do not experience in lust, and you do not experience, at least in the early phases of romantic attraction. The function is to enable new parents to remain together at least long enough to rear a child through infancy. So none of these functions are very like awe-inducing, but we're talking about brain regions and neurotransmitters that haven't really changed a heck of a lot in about 250,000 years. Humans still have about the same brain that we did 250,000 years ago, and we have changed a lot. Our society and our culture has changed a lot since then. Just to orient you to these pictures, the one on the left is actually my mom and my dad on the day I was born. So that I just absolutely love this picture, and I get to use it in a talk. So there. Um, and then we have another example of a long-term, loving, stable couple in our former president Barack and Michelle Obama, which I also love. I was trying to find the one where he was giggling while she was dancing or doing something silly, but I couldn't find that one. That's another good one. As I said, brain activity during romantic attachment is primarily characterized by the formation and maintenance of social bonds. And long-term stable relationships are associated with not just calm and peace and security, but also reduced anxiety when together. So this is something that, oh, I see a raised hand. I can go ahead and stop and take a question if you'd like.
Uh,
Yeah.
all right, Dave and Dolores.
Yeah, I wondered on the function why, to enable new parents to remain together at least long enough to raise a child through infancy. Why that time limitation? Because a child is certainly not viable without support much longer than that. So
Yeah.
I wonder about that limitation.
That's a great question, and this definition was written to be as broad as possible. So the raising a child through infancy, pardon me?
No, I'm just commenting on the at least aspect of the definition.
Yeah, so infancy, well, how long is infancy? 5 years?
2 years. Oh, I thought it was 2 years.
2 years? I'm not a parent, so I don't know.
Oh.
What is it? What is a 3-year-old? A preschooler? So when I think through
no,
infancy,
infancy to me is pretty much before speech.
yeah, and I would guess that the infancy aspect of this definition is meant to get past that initial phase of child rearing where you can't really do a heck of a lot else until the child is, I guess they're not really walking at 2 years old, but those first couple of years are super intense in terms of human child rearing. But the term infancy is not just reserved for humans, and because in this talk includes aspects of primates that aren't human necessarily. So
Mm-hmm.
so there are so that's what I mean by the definition was written as broad as possible. If we're talking specifically about humans, you could certainly argue that two parents are necessary for much longer than that. But in terms of promoting success of offspring, beyond that first initial very intense rearing period where you really can't do much else, in our country we quantify that as 4 months, which is clearly much too, not enough time. In other countries, they're quantifying that as a year, which is, probably a little bit more realistic. And your definition, you're saying 2 years. So this is meant to sort of capture not just the lust aspect, not just the I've chosen the correct partner aspect, but now I've had offspring and I need to stick around at least until I'm convinced that that offspring are viable. In the animal kingdom, and I'm concluding not just primates here, but the animal kingdom in general, there are numerous examples of species that mate for life. So they do not produce offspring with any other individual unless that individual dies, and in which case they select a new mate. There's also individuals or species where they stay together for one full breeding season, and then they choose a different individual during the next breeding season. And then there are countless examples of, of everything in between, where individuals are choosing different mates. Both males and females are choosing different mates during the breeding season. So this is meant to kind of identify the species that stay together to raise offspring, and 2, the fact that there are a lot of definitions of infancy that we can use when we're talking about romantic attachment. But you're right. It's a little bit of a squishy, hard line to put on attachment. Absolutely, I'm gonna agree with you on that one.
Okay,
I hope I've addressed your question. Okay, yeah.
I have a few questions and comments. First of all, we have someone who has consulted Wikipedia, and they say the term infant is typically applied to young children under 1 year of age.
Under one.
The definitions may vary and may include children up to 2 years of age.
Yeah.
When a human child learns to walk, the term toddler may be used instead.
Okay, so that's like 3, right? They start to walk around there, yeah.
And then we have a question. Are romantic attractions more valuable for those who suffer from dopamine deficiency?
Are romantic attractions more important or more beneficial for individuals that result in dopamine deficiency? That is a really interesting question. Can I put a pin in that one and talk about that when we have a little bit more time? I am almost to the end. I've got about 6 slides left. Can I take that question first when we get to the discussion portion?
Okay.
Because I have.
Let's see. Maybe the other. Maybe we'll keep the rest of them to the end also.
Yeah, let's keep the discussion ones till the end. That way we can get through it. But that's a really interesting question. I have some thoughts, but I want to go ahead and move along.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim. So yes, romantic attachment promotes that calming feeling and reduces anxiety when together, which we've already established begins to happen during that romantic attraction part of the continuum. But what you also have that you might not necessarily have with these earlier phases of love is actual separation anxiety when apart for long periods of time. So separation anxiety is not the same as being motivated to maintain proximity, that sort of obsessive thinking about the individual. This means that your overall general fear and anxiety is elevated when you are not near that person. You also have elevated levels of oxytocin and vasopressin. So let's just sort of review, right? For the autonomic function, you've got, for lust, you've got increases in, say, epinephrine and norepinephrine. You also have increases in testosterone and estrogen. I didn't say that explicitly. So that's lust. For the romantic attraction part, you're getting mostly increases in dopamine. And in the romantic attachment phase, you're getting increases in things like oxytocin and vasopressin. Now, this phase of love was examined using a similar study that was used during the romantic attachment phase. And it's done by at least one of the same authors, Helen Fisher, who we've been talking about, and Arthur Aaron. These 2 individuals had done a lot of the research that's being discussed in this particular talk. They used a few more scales. You'll see the passionate love scale, that's familiar. We also have the Eros subscale, which measured passionate romantic love. And this is on that continuum, the triangular theory, where the individual is, these surveys are trying to assess the degree to which long-term couples have each of those triangles or each of those points of the triangle. So the Eros subscale of love is also going to assess that degree of passionate and romantic love. You've got the inclusion of other in the self scale, which is meant to measure the degree of closeness. To what extent do you include the other in your own sense of self, your own perception of who you are? And then you've got the friendship-based love scale, which is going to measure that companionate love, that kind of liking for one another, the emotional intimacy aspect of a relationship. So there's a few more scales that are used to assess this. And their hypothesis is that there is an underlying attachment system that coordinates proximity seeking that will create and maintain those social bonds. So in this particular study, they came at it a little differently. In this case, I'm going to use my mom's husband as the test subject. And so in session 1, the test subjects were shown photos of their partner. So there's my mom, and also a high familiar neutral picture. So a high familiar neutral is a neutral acquaintance that controls for that aspect of familiarity, like your brain responding to, I recognize this person, but not to the closeness that you would have with your spouse. So they did the same kind of, show the photo, do the count back task, show the photo, do the count back task that we talked about previously. And then in session 2, they repeated it, except not using the spouse, but instead using a close friend. So a close friend is someone who you do have a close positive interaction with, but it's not a romantic interaction. So it's the control for like the friendship, the liking aspect, that point of the triangular theory or the triangular theory of love. And then the other was a low familiar neutral. So an additional control for familiarity. So this individual knows this person, but doesn't have the same degree of familiarity that they do with any of the first 3 individuals that are being shown. So the same sort of, count back tasks show the close friend, and then the count back task, and then the low familiar neutral, and then the count back task. So there's a lot more controls in this for degree of familiarity, because we've got that aspect of love that would be tough to control for if you didn't separate out the activity that's associated with the familiarity as well as the kind of emotional intimacy, the liking aspect of it versus, visual stimulus, looking at faces, so we've got different ways to control for that brain activity that's being handled in this particular study. And what they found is that there was the same kind of activity in the ventral tegmental area and the caudate body. So remember, the ventral tegmental area and the caudate body were elevated in individuals who, in that second phase, that romantic attraction phase. So this suggests that subjects that are in long-term intense romantic love, they still had the presence of those early stage romantic attraction kinds of feelings, even after controlling for close friendship and familiarity, that same romantic attraction was still there, that was initiated during that second phase. But there's also elevated activity in the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra. And these are regions that are rich in receptors that are associated with seeking out, forming, and maintaining those social bonds, those pair bonds that are necessary if we're talking in a broad definition for rearing offspring, but in the context of long-term relationships outside of offspring that are necessary to keep those social bonds and those pair bonds strong. So you've got some elevated activity in this area as well. Now, one of the things, am I zooming along too much? Usually I would stop here and ask for questions, but we're already at 4:08, and I know we want to end in 20-ish minutes. So let me put this study down there first, because one thing that I noticed in reading the literature is that it was very, very focused on heterosexual couples, and I think it's really important to address in trying to maintain an elevated sense of equity and inclusivity to figure out, okay, what studies have been conducted on same-sex couples and how did their brains respond if different. And so this study did focus on viewing faces of opposite and same-sex partners together, and found that there were no differences between men and women and no differences between heterosexual and homosexual couples. So the same kinds of studies were done with same-sex versus opposite-sex couples, and the bottom line, love is love, people. Our brains are responding similarly. All right, so let's summarize what we've got for this last phase. Romantic attachment is calming, right? The dopaminergic regions, so regions that are increasing in dopamine, mediate the wanting aspect of reward that still is present. So that's the ventral tegmental area and the caudate body that were the same in romantic attachment and romantic attraction. But additionally, the opioidergic regions, things like the globus pallidus and the septum, are also more active, which are more the pleasure aspect, the liking aspect of reward. So you've got the seeking, the wanting, but then when you get that reward, you can experience either pleasure or displeasure. So those opioid regions are increasing to show that yes, there is pleasure in getting this reward. And also those two regions, the globus pallidus and the septum, are very rich in those receptors for neurotransmitters that are critical for forming and maintaining social bonds. So that's very unique. The one region that I didn't, I'm sorry, was there a question that I should stop? Or can you give me like 2 more slides and then we can get there? 2 more slides?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. One brain region that I didn't show on the previous slide, but that I did not want to skip talking about, is the dorsal raphe nucleus. This is a serotonergic area that's activated by both the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra, and this is involved in pain and stress reduction. Why do we include this particular region in the context of romantic attachment? Well, the dorsal raphe nucleus it suggests that the goal of the attachment system is to feel secure and to buffer an individual from stressful events. And based on the connections that we observe in each of these networks, the fact that the dorsal raphe nucleus is fed by the ventral tegmental area, which is active during both attraction and attachment, as well as the substantia nigra, which is active during attachment, that part of the goal of this entire attachment system, starting with lust, moving to attraction, getting to attachment, is to facilitate the formation of those social bonds, which are so important in buffering us from stress. And the reason why I've got this the reason why I've got this cute little macaque picture on there is that non-human primates also experience social buffering from stressful events when they have formed strong social bonds as well. So this does not appear to be specific to human primates. All right, so let's do some overall conclusions here before we end for the day and I start taking some questions. When we're talking about the neurobiology of love, we can broadly categorize this as yearning. Yearning initially for sex, yearning then for reward, and finally yearning for proximity and the formation of strong social bonds. These types of love are interdependent and bidirectional. There's no, one flow. There's no restriction to 2 parts or 1 part or all 3 parts. They're all connected to one another and bidirectional, but they are also independent. Romantic attachment for long-term mates and romantic attractions to a different person can occur simultaneously. They're not dependent on one another. Sex drive responses to stimuli that are completely unrelated to either the individual who you are romantically attached to or the individual who you are romantically attracted to. So these things can exist completely independently from one another, as well as for the same person. And that just kind of harkens back. Remember I said I was going to call back to that triangular theory of love? It sort of harkens back to those points. The bottom line is that love is a primary aspect of our complex human reproductive strategy. People of every age and culture sing and pray and work and live and kill and die for love. Further, there are biologically relevant pathways that motivate us, that reward us and calm us when we are in love. The bottom line, all you need is love. All right. So the first question that I wanted to take was that question about whether or not, oh, sorry, I can stop sharing my screen. Whether or not individuals, oh, sorry, what did I just do? Whether or not individuals who have issues with dopamine production are more, I can't remember what the word was, enriched or benefited more from romantic attraction. I think it was more beneficial. So, or is it more beneficial? Yeah, or important. So the easy answer would be yes, the individual needs dopamine. But the thing that mediates that dopamine response is the own individual's capacity to produce it. So think about it in the context of caffeine. Someone who doesn't drink a lot of caffeine can stay awake for a long time if they have just a teeny tiny amount. Now, the idea here is that that individual has a lot of caffeine receptors that are proliferated all throughout the brain. And so drinking a small amount will bind to many, many, many of those receptors. But if someone has been, drinking tons and tons of coffee for years and years and years, and getting flooded with that sort of caffeine rush and response, the body compensates by reducing the proliferation of caffeine receptors so that there's, just a few, so that when that individual is drinking all that caffeine, there are fewer receptors for that caffeine to bind to, and therefore the caffeine response that maybe was really intense in the early coffee drinking phases is now more blunted. And so it doesn't matter that the person drinks, 2 coffee pots a day. Ultimately, their response has been mediated by their receptors. And so in terms of dopamine production and binding, if the individual has a dopamine deficiency, they're probably starting off with a lower production and receptor capacity. Could be either, it doesn't have to be both, but it could be either. And so while there is absolutely an upregulation of dopamine during attraction, the actual response itself may still be blunted. So it's tough to really say if there's more benefit or if they just kind of get to baseline. But in either case, romantic attraction doesn't last forever. Sometimes it only lasts a month or something, or a couple of weeks. Sometimes it lasts for like a year and a half. That term is variable depending on the individuals and the relationship, but it does end. And so the question about benefit or advantage is going to be moderated by that. Yeah.
Value was the term he used.
Value, yeah. So I think it's going to be moderated by that.
Okay. All right, I have another question here. Is it true that men are less interested in long-term relationships, that is commitment phobia? If so, why?
The brain and neurochemistry suggests that there is no difference. There are certainly loads and loads and loads and loads of research that suggests that the brains of men and women process information differently. And so oftentimes when you're talking about whether or not men are more or less interested in long-term relationships, it doesn't really have to do with the attachment system that we discussed, and rather just more about, a person's general compatibility or willingness to share their space and their lives with others. But in terms of this very narrow scope, with the brain regions and neurotransmitters that are active, there is no difference between men and women. Does that answer your question?
Okay, so the next question is, to what extent do hormones affect these concepts of brain activity? For example, after menopause, I'm suspecting women have different brain activity driven by hormonal changes. Do you have any information about that?
Yeah, so during menopause, the hormones that are being affected are things like estrogen and progesterone. Those are the hormones that are most critical in the lust aspect of this phase. So if anything were going to be affected, it would likely be that phase, but less about attraction and attachment. So yeah, there are certainly some byproducts based on fluctuations of those hormones for sure.
Okay, next question. How does parental love fit in here?
Yeah, parental love will fit in terms of the forming and maintenance of social bonds. So you've got um, one of the wonderful tricks of nature is that when a woman gives birth, her system is flooded with oxytocin. Oxytocin is that, and actually when the sort of male analog is vasopressin and the female analog is oxytocin. But when men and women have sex, there's also an increase in that particular hormone. So oxytocin is a social bonding kind of hormone, and it's just flooded when a woman when a woman gives birth. And so this serves some really critical purpose in terms of bonding to your infant, but it also mysteriously makes that woman have amnesia and forget all about the horrific experience of giving birth, and they're all ready to go ahead and do it again after that first one. It's a mystery to me why anybody would choose to do that more than once, but that's why I don't have kids.
Okay, so the next question, I have found it interesting that with age, I'm 72, I am less able to be sexually aroused without mood or actual affection than I was when I was younger. My responses have moved to be more similar to those reported by young females. Comments?
Um, yeah, so there's a lot that's happening there. The hormones are certainly less. Testosterone is critical for maintaining that lust, that libido, that sex drive in males. Estrogen more for females, although females also have testosterone. And one of the byproducts of aging is a decrease in testosterone. So it makes sense that libido, that sex drive, would decrease with time over as an individual gets older. And then I think the second part of that question was comparing to younger females,
Right.
or that
Yes.
that younger females have lower sex drive. Is that what
That
the
they compare
implication was?
themselves, their response to younger females, what they think younger females are like.
Yeah, I'm with younger females. There's also fluctuation in hormone levels, right? I mean, not just during uh, over the course of the month. Every time I bring this up, anytime I talk about human reproduction and sexuality in my university classes, it's really hard to prevent people from making the conclusion that women have a period of receptivity. There's certainly a suggestion that when women were watching those erotic films, that it was best to assess them during ovulation when those responses are at their peak. But periods of receptivity are specifically reserved for discussing species that do not reproduce, do not engage in intercourse outside of a particular prescribed period of the year. And that's just not the case for humans. So while women, from the point that they, I guess, mid teenage years, through who knows when, I guess I don't know that literature, the time span of um, sexual libido for women. But there are fluctuations during the course, not just of the month, but over the course of the lifespan. So it makes sense that there would be fluctuations. But human sex response is complex. It's not just about hormones. It's not just about neurotransmitters. It's not just about brain regions. There's all sorts of stuff involved. So there could be other explanations that control for alterations in sex drive and libido.
Okay. Next question is, how does polyamory relate? Can one go through all phases simultaneously with multiple partners?
Yeah, yeah. The beautiful thing about the world and the individuals that exist within it is that there is enormous variability. And just like there's variability in sex orientation, there's variability in terms of monogamy, polyamory, polygyny, all of those things. So what specifically in the brain is happening for an individual who prefers monogamy versus polyamory, that I can't answer, but it's certainly, individuals who are monogamous, whether heterosexual or homosexual, compared to individuals who are polyamorous, are still operating with the same basic structures of the brain and the same basic neurotransmitters. So the stimuli that elicit those responses are infinitely variable, but the actual structures and neurotransmitters themselves are pretty constant.
Okay, next question is, are there any studies looking at deficiencies or excess of neurophysiological pathways in pathologic types of love, such as stalkers or sex addicts, or perhaps people who marry 8 times?
I don't know about the marrying 8 times, but in terms of individuals that have fetishes, what you're seeing is whether that's, whatever the fetish happens to be, what you're seeing is an elevated response in that reward region. So the brain regions that I described as mediating drive directed behaviors are located within the broader reward system of the brain. That's why romantic attraction is rewarding. And so individuals that have fetishes are experiencing that flood of rewarding brain activity and neurotransmitters in response to certain non-human or other types of human stimuli. And so that, again, variation in the human sex experience, it's infinitely variable.
Okay. The next question, can you say more about the role of pheromones in humans?
Yeah, I would love to, because that's not something that I really could fit into kind of a nice, concise talk. So there's a lot of controversy in the literature about whether humans respond to pheromones. We do not have the specific organ nor the projections to our olfactory bulb that are present in species that are known to respond to pheromones. So the specific organ is called the vomeronasal organ. And those species that have this, horses, cats, there's a bunch of mammals, all mammals, but there's a bunch of species that have this. They have these special projections to the accessory olfactory bulb that are designed to detect pheromones. And the whole purpose of pheromones is to seek and maintain proximity to an individual that is of your species at the right time to produce offspring. That's kind of what pheromones are all about. So there's this controversy that starts with the fact that we have that missing. Although if you look at your nose, in the mirror, you'll see these little pits right here. They're meant to say that the idea is that that's where our vomeronasal organ holes used to be. So it's sort of like a vestigial pit. That's where they thought that it might be. Snakes still have those holes where they can, take their forked tongue and they stick it right into those holes. So our holes are kind of vestigial. But even though it's missing, there's all sorts of literature that suggests that we're responding to something, like that t-shirt study. Have you guys heard of the t-shirt study where women and men wore t-shirts and then packaged them in a package and mailed them off to the lab? And then the lab enrolled some subjects to smell the t-shirts, and they had to identify which t-shirts smelled the best. And then they also had all their subjects submit blood samples so they could identify they're called major histocompatibility complexes, but there are little tags on every single cell of our body that are different for every individual. The only people who have the same tags are identical twins, and it's these tags that make organ transplants so problematic sometimes. But they found that the smells from the individuals that the subjects found most attractive had a set of major histocompatibility complexes, or MHCs, that were the most different from them. So this suggests that there is some response to pheromones, but like I said, there's just a lot of controversy about how exactly that's happening because we don't have a vomeronasal organ anymore. We don't have an olfactory or accessory olfactory bulb anymore. So how is it working? How does this do that? Yeah, so it's a great question. I sorry if I was a little emphatic, but it's really cool, and I don't have any great answers for you.
Okay, next question. How reliable are functional MRI results? There have been some stories that they're not very reproducible.
So functional magnetic resonance imaging is going to track the flow of blood. And the idea behind fMRIs is that you need more blood in the regions that are active, right? So that's the whole idea behind fMRIs. And your brain is responding to stimuli all the time, you know, noises and sights and smells and sounds, and you're hungry, you're thirsty, you're, oh my God, you're annoyed. You know, your brain is just responding to all sorts of stimuli. So yeah, in order to have good reproducibility from study to study, you really do need to have the same set of controlled circumstances. And so part of this is solved by having lots of subjects to reach a certain level that will enable you to detect differences in groups if it's there. So there's things like power and effect size. These are statistical techniques that enable individuals to identify differences if they actually exist. But because your brain is responding to stimuli all the time, it does make it hard to sort out what's experimental related and what's kind of ancillary related, which is why those exquisite controls were used in all of those studies to try to really isolate the activity that's directed towards this specific stimuli. So yeah, it's problematic, but not impossible. You know, you can certainly run controlled studies where you get reliable results for sure. I don't know if that answered your question. I can't see who did it. Lots of people have their cameras off. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, so the next question is there neurologically a more or less beneficial time in one's life to be more romantically in love for the different types, lust, attachment, and attraction?
All periods of life need all of these things all the time. It's very beneficial. Being in love is great. But are there certain periods of your life where it's more advantageous versus less? I'm not familiar with any studies that examine that empirically, but based on, you know, the brain regions and the neurotransmitters that are involved, I would say, you know, that it's good no matter what, no matter how old you are. Fall in love, do something to reconnect with your partner, you know, have a good time. That's my
Okay.
professional advice.
So we're about out of time, but I will leave you with this one, which may be something that would require lots of time to answer, but I'll throw it out anyway.
Yeah.
Where would you put Jeffrey Epstein?
Oh, deviant with a capital D. All the letters capital, actually. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we're about out of time, and it looks like we've got all the questions answered anyway.
Cool.
And
Thank you all for having me, and
thank
thank you,
you for your
Jim, for inviting me back again.
yeah,
I love speaking to the humanists. I would love to see you all again in person, like I did last year. Hopefully, this time next year we will be able to be face to face again. But
yes.
I think you all are wonderful. Thank you for having me again, and I hope you have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Sarah.
you. Bye. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming.